started. There we go. Can't even get started. I'm on mute. All right, I'm off mute. Hey, Laura. Hey, Sasha. Thank you both for being here. Others, welcome to our Powering Blue 22 post-election series for folks who are looking to learn more about career opportunities in democratic and progressive politics. I am happy to be here. I was just saying to you too, I haven't actually done a session myself yet, so I've been like totally off screen and wasn't even prepared for this one. But you two are women I've known for a very long time, each of you uniquely. So this is easy for me to jump in with questions. I appreciate you both willing to be here on a Saturday afternoon. We got this started Thursday afternoon, but we always do this a little bit on Saturdays for folks who do have jobs. So anyway, I know you have a lot going on. I'd just like to welcome you and ask you just briefly to introduce yourselves and tell a little bit about what I will just call your career journey, how you got started and leading up to where you are now. Maybe take a couple minutes each, and then I've got a bunch of questions.
Great. Well, my name is Laura Packard. I live here in Denver. I am a small business owner. I have a digital consulting firm, and I also serve as executive director of Healthcare Voter. And I work with a whole bunch of other different healthcare policy-focused organizations. I have bounced back and forth between campaigns and nonprofits for the past decade, going on 2 decades now. This is something that probably a lot of you will do because campaign jobs have an end date, and nonprofit jobs don't always have the excitement of campaign jobs. So if you're a bit of an adrenaline junkie, you may also jump back and forth. Or you can find places to do advocacy that have a mix of both. And today we're going to be talking about lobbying and government relations. But again, if you're coming from campaign world, you'll find that a lot of the relationships you make on campaigns will carry over to when you are doing lobbying and government relations work. And then also you will have the motivation to do accountability if the people you help elect do not deliver on legislation. So kick it over to Sasha.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here with Laura and Amy. I'm Sasha Bruce, and I sit in DC. I live with my husband, my 2 kids, and my mother. And I, right now, am focused on the Build Back Better passage. I am directing the Coalition on Care, and I'm co-directing a multi-issue coalition called Real Recovery Now, both really centered in Build Back Better. I started doing politics in 1999, and I have a bit of a circuitous path to getting here. And I think that I have focused on electoral campaigns and legislative campaigns, but from the perspective of institutional organizations for the most part. So I haven't had that bounce as much as people who are on candidate campaigns exclusively, even though I may be focused on the same defeat or elect people. It's just I've been in places, which we'll get to, that that continue that advocacy to what the election was for and turn it into legislative advocacy. So I also have worn both hats.
I'm going to keep going. There's a little bit of a time delay in mine, so I'm like making sure I'm not talking on top of you. I apologize. You know, I'm obviously much more of a political person, like both of you have worked on lots of issue campaigns, but even listening to you describe your work, for folks who are maybe new to this work, whether they're new because they're young or they're new because they're changing careers, whatever the case may be, I feel like you've already thrown around a lot of what I would call jargon that folks don't necessarily always understand the language or terminology around. And we were very intentional inviting you to this panel because even when we hear the words lobbying or government relations, I think people imagine like K Street, you know, corporate lobbyists or something. And, you know, in our world, it's very different. But I'd love to hear you sort of expand upon what lobbying means to you, what advocacy means to you, and thinking about it from a career path, not just your own, but as you've seen others. What kind of skills do you think are needed? And again, it's a word that I think of a lot of people hear and sort of almost have a viscerally negative reaction. But I think it's really critical work, and I'd love to expand upon that point too. So, Laura, you want to start?
Sure. Well, lobbying is, I'm hearing myself echo. Is that fixed? Okay. Lobbying, I think, is a word that people are scared of, but every time you call your senators and tell them to do something, you are lobbying. So it doesn't have to be as scary as it sounds. And as an activist, you're probably involved in lobbying on a local, state, and a federal level. So it isn't always about contacting your reps and your senators to vote for Build Back Better, for example. It could be calling on your mayor to do something or to not do something, or calling on your state representatives, your state senators to do something or not do something. So this year, 2021, I worked a bit on the American Rescue Plan. And also I worked on public option bills in Colorado and Nevada. So I did federal work and state work. And depending on what you do, what organizations you work with, you probably also do a mix of things. And it may be easier to get started actually on a state level if you already have those state relationships. There's less competition in that there's a lot of people that want to move to Washington, D.C. every year and get jobs. And maybe you'll get that job, but it could be that you will find an easier start getting started locally, and then you can make the jump once you have a track record to Washington.
Amy kind of talked about how people have sometimes a negative reaction to the word lobbying. Sometimes when I'm like really in my head and my soapbox, I have a whole rant about how I want to take back the term special interests, because we have the same kind of connotation to the term special interest, unless that special interest is something that is really near and dear to what we use every day to make life work, or that is close to our values, right? When we think about supporting teachers or having access to healthcare, like those are all special interests. And I say that because the term that I actually use in my work all the time, but sometimes I forget to actually connect it to myself, is the kind of lobbying that I pretty much have always done. Is grassroots lobbying, right? It is taking the subject matter of being kind of an expert in mass communications, right? In this case, the mass communications are voters. If you're talking about an election, it's just constituents. Many of them are usually voters. If it's the case of a legislative campaign, but the kind of lobbying that I do is getting as many of them to do something as is possible. And so sometimes that's like in their community, in their state. Sometimes that is virtual with an email, phone call. I'm going to call that virtual in this example. And sometimes that is like asking a few people that you then spend an enormous amount of time curating to do the heavy lifting, right? Which is actually giving you their time to then come and be a grassroots lobbyist in person, right? That could be a drive, that could be getting on a plane to come to DC. And I think that the folks that are like straight up subject matter experts, and as we traditionally think of lobbyists, are needed, even in the kind of advocacy spaces that we, I'm making an assumption here because you're all here, care about. They're really necessary and needed because the policy specifics are critical to understand and translate. But none of that works unless you show the power of the masses. And both of those are lobbying. And I think there's such beauty in that. I'll stop there.
What other, again, I'm so biased because I know you both and I know your skills, so it's fun. But for others who don't, you know, you have some similar skills and you have some different skills. Oops, sorry. I knew the dogs may go crazy here. I mean, Laura, you have such an incredible personal story that I think is so relevant to the work that you do. So I don't know if you want to share any of that. I don't know if you get tired of sharing it. I know I've seen you, but I do think it's really important. And Sasha, even now, especially you at home with the kids, I mean, I think the relevance to the work you're doing is like very different. We're not just like activist organizers. You are people who are actually impacted by the work that you do. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that too.
Sure. I'll start. So I started doing healthcare policy work in 2009 when the AFL-CIO sent me to Arkansas. One of the things that I was working on was to help get the Affordable Care Act passed in the first place. So that was where I really started in healthcare policy work. And then I had no idea that many years later it was going to affect me directly because 4 years ago I was diagnosed with cancer and the Affordable Care Act saved my life. And then at that point, I started doing more advocacy work around the ACA under the Trump era as an individual and plugged into organizations and so on. So I did a lot of public-facing communications work, advocacy in that I was calling Senator Heller every day, but I wasn't doing lobbying per se. I was doing public work to push on the accountability piece as people made these bad votes. And then this year, I stepped up from being a co-chair of Healthcare Voter to being the executive director. So this year, I have done a lot more policy work, but then a lot of us, I think, have done a lot more federal policy work this year because this is the first time in a decade that we've had the opportunity to push a lot of the things we care about, because this is the first time in a decade that we've had the presidency and the House and the Senate controlled by at least nominally Democrats. So I think in a lot of this lobbying and government relations work, you work a long time in the trenches without perhaps success. Like you're just trying to stop the river from flooding. And then all of a sudden on a dime, things beyond your control can turn into all of a sudden you get to build stuff. But that moment may be brief. So you have to be patient, I think, in this work because it can be a lot of work, years, decades even without success. I mean, the child tax credit this year under Bennett, I think, is something that people have been talking about for generations, and now we finally have it.
Yeah, so true. I am often reminded, and one of my favorite quotes of, you know, the arc of the moral universe is long but bends towards justice, and it is very long. I know myself as someone who's worked on a lot of different issues, but the example I always give is LGBTQ rights, which I started working on, you know, in the early 90s. And it took decades plus to see significant change, which for probably a lot of people felt like it happened very quickly and certainly started long before I did. So yeah, I think all these micro activities and micro events obviously build towards big change that we're all really working for, but the day-to-day slog of it can feel tedious and can feel frustrating, I think, probably especially, and I'd love to hear obviously to support the White House and the progressive agenda right now. And it's a hard time where we have control, but we don't seem to be making the progress that we want. And I know there's a lot of folks who are demoralized by the lack of support, perhaps, that we have from some folks on our side. So I'm curious about your advice for folks who are maybe frustrated about how you kind of stay positive, how you stay focused, and how you do count the little wins.
So I think that is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about lately. And I will say, I don't think that we, and I'm speaking about the greater progressive we, spend enough time celebrating the wins. And I don't mean like genuinely celebrating it, because I do actually think we do that. But I mean how long that celebration lasts and how much energy and capacity, right? Capacity in all the ways, right? Money, time, emails, to communicate to people what that, like the ARP, which Laura talked about that she was involved in passing, was just a huge, huge stimulus in like the American people, an investment that we haven't seen like since the Great Depression. If we are successful in passing Build Back Better, that will completely solidify that, like that benchmark, right? The last time we've had an investment this big has been since the 40s. And I mean, that happened on the heels of kicking Trump out of office. And it doesn't mean that we have a lot invested in making those things permanent that are really encapsulated in Build Back Better. It doesn't mean we don't have our sights set on the horizon in real tangible ways that will change people's lives, that we're counting on Democrats to do, because if they don't do it while they have that supermajority, we're not going to have a chance for a long time. But I think that we very quickly jump to the demoralized and the glass half full, because we have such big aspirations that people actually need to change their lives. Like, these are all really good things. But we also just need to spend more time celebrating the benchmarks that have been passed. I have this dream in my head for somebody to actually spend an enormous amount of PSA money for a really long time talking about what government does, because I think that like that is the connective tissue, and to connect like the perennial message in America, which is patriotism, to taxes and like the things that we accomplish as a perennial message of like, let's remember what our government does and what we contribute to every single year. So sorry, that's my little soapbox for today. But this is also the soapbox that I do to myself to keep my glass half full, because it's not how I feel every moment of every day.
Add to that, Laura. I'm curious your thoughts too.
Well, I agree 100% with what Sasha said, that we are really bad at taking our victory laps. Like, how many people right now know that their health insurance costs are lower because Democrats in Congress passed a bill? How many people know that they're getting money every month for their kids because Democrats did it without a single Republican vote? You know, I don't think that we are doing our jobs right when we fail to say that again and again and again, because I think most people don't know that. I think that the people that just voted in Virginia don't necessarily know what Glenn Youngkin's agenda is and what they're going to do. I think that people are busy, and especially during this pandemic, we all have a lot on our plates, and not everybody lives for this stuff. Not everybody reads the paper cover to cover, and even if you do, you don't always get the details of who's doing what and why. So I think it's on us to be better at that. But how to make your glass more full? Move to a state that has legalized marijuana. I don't know. Take more vacations after Build Back Better finally happens, baby. I mean, it's sort of difficult to answer that question when we all are living in a state of existential dread with this pandemic and attempts to overthrow our democracy. So no good answers there.
Well, I appreciate both your feedback. I know that I was having a random side chat with a young organizer the other day who was himself demoralized, and was partly demoralized because so many others that he'd been chatting with were talking about finding other careers. So back to just kind of the career focus here. Talk about some of the, I mean, again, you both have some similar skills, but talk about the ways people can do work in this area. Obviously, I mean, I always think about it both around issues. I think about organization types and of course skill types, but advice for folks who want to do this work, because I also think there are a lot of people who really do, and frankly I think there are so many more people who would do this work if they even knew they could, if they knew they could actually get paid and make a career. I feel like we'd be overwhelmed with talent, and I think folks just don't understand this is work you can actually do for a living.
Well, I think that the people that make six figures and have a fancy title like lobbyist and are registered lobbyists and so on, that's pretty rarefied air. You need to have years, maybe decades of experience. You need to have those relationships built in, but you can get started in ways that are a lot more approachable than that. You could try being the policy person for a startup campaign. You could be entry level at a nonprofit. You could be entry level on the Hill. Those jobs are hard to get, but still somebody gets them. And I think a lot of it depends on relationships, because you can go to Gain Power and look at their job listings, or you can go to Idealist or whatever. But a lot of people are doing that route. And if you don't know anybody there, it's going to be harder to get your foot in the door. So what I recommend for everybody is make your networks as big as possible. If you're working for a campaign or an organization, friend as many people as possible. Friend them, connect with them on LinkedIn, follow them on social media, build those sort of soft relationships, because you never know when a friend of a friend or somebody you barely know is going to come back to you and be hiring.
That's great advice. I think I'll say two things. One, this is like a great year coming up to join a campaign, right? An election year, an even year is always a great year to do that. And you can do that on an issue, right? If you're involved in education, you can do that through a teachers union. You can do that through like the candidates campaign themselves. There's like so many opportunities as you head into a new year. A new even numbered year where there's going to be an election. Again, things normal people don't think about, which is it an even year? And what does that mean? Or is it an odd number year? But I will say, I think that I'm an example of getting into this work really accidentally. I was offered an internship on Capitol Hill, and I was an American. My father is American, but I never lived in this country or was educated in this country until I went to college. So, for all intensive purposes, I was an international student, and you don't learn civics in college. Everybody here learns civics in grade school. So I literally had no idea how a bill became a law. And I knew I wanted to do international work. I knew that DC was a place where lots of people did international work. And so I said yes to this internship. And I also had to lie to my mother about it because, when you're an immigrant, you work like 3 jobs to get your kids through college. You don't think the first job they're going to have is a job that pays them 0. So I maxed out my credit cards and I rented a room for the summer at American University, and I worked for nothing. And I totally lied to my mother and told her I was making some money. Luckily, I got a job in that congressional office a couple months later, and was making $24,000, which was a lot when you go from 0. And I worked on the Hill for a year, and I checked out books that I hid from people from the Library of Congress that taught me how a bill became a law. And after a year, I was like, this is interesting. I get why people want to work here, but it's too slow for me. And so the next year was an even year. And I basically started trying my hand at electoral politics. Some amazing woman who might be on the screen gave me a shot. Thank you, Amy. And I learned a lot. And mostly I learned that I liked it. And I learned a lot of new skills, and I learned what I was good at. And coming out of there, I think the various like organizations that that I ended up doing work for ended up being unions, and for a long time, unions were my focus in where I worked, and what I learned is what was important to me. And I could talk to you about like the mechanics of the work. And that's probably actually helpful because there are definite like benchmarks of things I don't want to do in a job, regardless of whether I'm good at them or not. I just don't enjoy them. But what has always been important to me is basically to work for a place that's kind of like my family, right? To work at places that mostly represent women and women of color, and a lot of times immigrants. So it's people like my mother. And then what I also learned that was really important to me is a membership-based organization. It, no matter what was happening, it never fazed me to work till, you know, whatever godforsaken hour it was, because there was a need, right? When there isn't a need, sometimes you can leave at 3 or 4, but like these aren't deadlines, right? Electoral deadlines, legislative deadlines aren't things that you can push back. So you're just there when you need to be there. And for me, knowing that janitors and union members and security guards are paying my salary, like it was a no-brainer to have my glass half full all the time. And so that was like really important to the kinds of places I worked. I didn't always work for unions, but I usually always worked for a place that was membership driven. Even now, where I'm in kind of a consulting role, the clients that I work with and the coalitions and the organizations that I work with still represent that makeup. And so when I tie that to the grassroots lobby and the people whose voices I'm trying to amplify, it's all very personal, right? It's not just it's not all just the job.
I'm doing it again. I was telling you guys that the video and your words are not lining up, and it keeps throwing me off. I'm like, are you still talking? Sorry about that. Laura, do you want to chime in on that too? I know.
Sure. I took a different path in that I worked in private industry right out of school, and I volunteered for political campaigns. And then I made the transition as a digital director or internet communications director, whatever title I had in 2006 for Senator Stabenow's reelect. So I came in not as a field organizer or really entry level, but I came in a sort of skilled role on a campaign. And then I've bounced from candidates to nonprofits and unions and so on, back and forth, and now been in consulting for several years. So your career path is probably going to be a little varied. Wherever you start out is maybe not where you're going to stay. And I recommend trying as many different things as possible. Like Sasha said, you need to get a sense of what you like and what you don't like. And you are building relationships all along. So if your end goal is to be in government relations, you're going to want as big a Rolodex as possible. So definitely work in as many different types of positions, in as many different types of organizations as possible, because all of that is building things that you will then come back to later. Because part of the reason why you would hire a lobbyist or a government relations person is who they know, who are their sources, who are their friends, and can they get a call returned when they need a call returned. That's what makes them effective.
Talk to me about, well, I've got a bunch of questions actually, but you're obviously talking from your own personal experiences, but talk about some of the other skills that are needed, or the other kind of folks who work around you maybe complement your own experiences. again, trying to just give the breadth of the kind of folks who do this work. And then I'll let you answer that. I've got a few others there.
Well, I would say in this world, it isn't necessarily you knowing everything as you knowing who knows. So you may not need to know an answer to any question, but you need to be able to pick up your phone or send an email and get that answer. So if you are actually lobbying legislators in your state capital or in Washington, D.C., they may ask you stuff and you may not have an immediate answer, but you need to be able to get them a quick answer. So I think whether you're naturally an introvert or an extrovert or whatever, you need to be building those relationships and making mental notes of who your experts are so that you may not know everything, but you know how to find out everything. That's one of the most useful skills you can have.
Sasha?
I'll add to that. I love the knowing who knows. I'm going to use that, Laura, because the amount of time we spend finding out answers to things quickly, and that like ties together the relationships. But I'll add, don't ask people to do things you're not willing to do yourself, right? I think that makes you a really great team player and leader and boss. It doesn't mean you always have to. As you get higher up, your time is spent differently, but it's different from being unwilling to do something and never kind of jumping into the thick of it sometimes. I'll give you an example. Right now, during Build Back Better, there is a bill, a human-sized bill that is walking around Capitol Hill. I am affectionately calling about 4 or 5 of us Bill's advance team. I'm actually talking about somebody from Schoolhouse Rock wearing a giant white Bill costume walking around Capitol Hill. And of course, we need somebody in the Bill costume that's appropriate. But Bill needs an escort for a couple of reasons. Bill can't see very well. Bill's peripheral vision is impaired. But also, we need somebody who can recognize members, senators, congresspeople, and be able to go up to them and say, hey, you want to come meet Bill? Let's take a picture with Bill. And Bill may sound silly right now, but in this pandemic slog that has been this year, Bill has infused some joy and permission to be happy and silly about the feats that we are trying to accomplish. So the tone of what Bill is achieving is really important. And in trying to find the appropriate escorts and an escort schedule for Bill in a totally PG way, people are offering up interns. And I'm like, no, this may seem like it's an intern job, but it is actually a senior staffer job. I need a senior, government affairs person, lobbyist who's available to give a whole day to go and escort Bill, because I need them to know members. I need them to know the congressional staffers. That's like, hey, can you get me in this door because there's a hearing or a caucus meeting happening and I want Bill to be outside of that. And even people that have been in this business for a long time, and sometimes that's me when it's something that I'm not thinking about, like a human-sized bill, need to be reminded that this is not a junior staffer's position, right? This isn't a job that you think you pass down the ranks. You actually need to go do this yourself. And now we actually have senior lobbyists that want to be inside of Bill and have a Bill cameo. It's a lot of joy. So I'll say that. I'll also say budgets. Being able to track and manage money is important. It is the single tangible thing that ties me to the membership organizations that I work for. Yes, it is my salary, but when you talk about thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of dollars, that you want people to actually entrust with you, because it only makes your advocacy bigger and the role that the things you're trying to accomplish in your role. people will trust you with more and more money if you can be a good steward of that. That means spending it well. That also means knowing exactly how much money you have, what has been paid, who has not been paid, make sure they are paid. Like being a good steward of money and very good with budgets is a key skill.
Yeah, and I would say make your peace with absurdity because in this world, there's a lot of it. I have gone across the state of Colorado with a cardboard cutout of a US senator. I have been locked in a campaign office with a human in a giant chicken suit banging on the windows. I've not yet been with a giant walking bill, but that is probably to happen in the future. So
you can be.
don't get stuck on because you do this work, you have to be serious and professional or whatever. Like you will meet more people dressed up as a robot haunting Marco Rubio than you could ever imagine. And those relationships will be very valuable in your future.
I love these stories of various events, and you're bringing back some different memories of my own here. I particularly love the bill. I'm one of those people that's actually been looking at them on Instagram and on YouTube and seeing everybody posing with Bill. So well done there. Very clever and very important. I like also you just shared your own personal story about not having seen Schoolhouse Rock, but I am someone who actually did grow up on Schoolhouse Rock, and that's part of, I think, probably what made me interested in working in politics and government. I'm curious, we sort of touched on this, but I want to frame the question a little bit differently. Tell me, I'll ask sort of the positive question and a negative question with the same frame, which is, what are you most worried about? And then what are you most optimistic about heading into this new year?
Most worried about, I'm most worried that we have this opportunity federally that we may not have for another decade, and that we don't take advantage of it, that we don't pass Build Back Better, that we don't pass democracy reforms to protect our democracy, which is more fragile than you could possibly think. So that's the bad thing. And the good thing is we have this opportunity. We have this opportunity that we haven't had in a decade to do great stuff. I mean, you can do great stuff on a state level. It's always easier to move legislation and make real changes on a state level, even when you're against big money. More money was dropped into Colorado against the public option than had ever been done in lobbying before, and it still passed. So on a state level, you can beat the money. It's a lot harder federally. But I think we have this moment and we have to use it or it will be gone.
I share that, so I won't be repetitive. But I'll do the, I have an echo. I don't know if you want to mute. I'll do my worry for the moment when Build Back Better does pass. Knock on wood. And that is, when you have a supermajority or an opportunity to do something really big, Build Back Better is like the embodiment of what you would want to see passed, right? It has a lot of stuff. It's going to change a lot of lives, but the tangible downside to it is, because it's not one thing, it is hard to digest to the average voter. And so without that echo chamber that is committed to spending time and money celebrating and communicating what is in these giant omnibus packages that are huge and, I mean, truly historic in, again, since the 40s. But I think that it is going to be hard in a year where democracy changes still need to be passed in the supermajority that we have before the end of the year, hopefully on the heels of Build Back Better. We have elections happening. We have Supreme Court challenges happening for that to be a focus. But the connective tissue about elections, making the legislation happen, and then informing everybody about it is actually necessary to keep everything going. And everything going is going to happen, in November of this coming year. So it's that connective tissue that is my worry. And I think the opportunity is this bill. I think it's just it's huge in terms of its scope, but some of the issues that it will that it embodies are things that have never been passed before, right? So when you talk about bigger investments, yes, sure. But when you talk about like groundbreaking things that we've been advocating for generations, climate, paid leave, any kind of childcare made permanent, pre-K, universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, that will change people's lives. I have 2 little kids downstairs, and I afforded preschool for them because I could pay for preschool for them. But that's the only path to get, like, not just childcare, but to get them educated. And even though they're not learning math, all of science tells us that, like, the years from 3 to 5 are as important as the years from 5 to 10. So when we talk about, like, trade challenges with China and all of this, educating like Americans is like the ground floor of that, and making sure their parents can go to work simultaneously is just huge. So I'm excited to sell the package, and I'm more excited to pass it first. Oh, I'll also add a personal to that. I would like to go and travel in 2022. That would be great because, pandemic.
Other, again, I am thinking about we're spending a lot of time actually here talking about federal stuff, but obviously a lot is happening in the states. How do you, I know you're both more federally focused legislatively anyway right now. Thoughts about doing this work from a state perspective and some of your experiences there and how they connect?
Well, planning is already going on for legislative session for next year. Colorado starts back up, I think, in mid-January, but some of the other states that I'm doing work in, also sort of start in January. State legislative session is a little bit of a different beast in that in most states, it is not full-time. It is not 12 months. It is spring and done. Most state legislatures wrap up May, June at the latest, and some are only in every other year. So it's not even every year. So it can be harder to have a policy type job in a state, but still, any sort of nonprofit organization or chapter of a decent size is going to have. They may have a contract lobbyist. They may work with a local lobbying firm, but they may have somebody on staff that does policy type work. So there are jobs there, and it's like I said a lot earlier, it's probably easier to get your start in state politics than it is in Washington D.C. unless you are willing and able to do an unpaid internship, or if you have those resources. But you can get a paid job in state legislative world, working for a staffer or working for a nonprofit. But again, if for staff here in Colorado, the legislature is very much part-time, and so is their staff. So those are jobs that it can be hard to make a reasonable living with, which is also something to keep in mind, that if you don't have the financial resources to keep doing it, you may have to do a short stint and then flip over to, try to get your way into a local lobbying firm, a local PR firm.
I really have been pretty ensconced in federal stuff recently. I will say that for those of you that are doing state work, for context, before the past couple years, as I did kind of coalition work around the HEROES Act and now Build Back Better, I was the number 2 at NARAL Pro-Choice America, and managed all of their policy, politics, digital apparatus, field, all of that stuff. And I think that basically this is a thread that's been true for like my union work, my reproductive rights work, and certainly now the organizations doing state work, more often than not, it's not a perfect overlay, but it is a majority overlay. The places that are competitive in a state are also sitting on top of competitive areas for federal. And so I find the organizations that can bridge the downtime with state legislatures and the relevance to the places where they have built their membership, where they have all of their kind of institutional memory, right? The folks that are doing the federal work are like desperate to invest in these places if they want to continue the same kind of tactical work in the same areas, just with a different message, right? And so for any of you that are taking jobs that are in a state organization that's dealing with the kind of schedules with the legislature that Laura's talking about, do kind of provoke and ask these questions, like what is the balance, even if it's a minority one, of federal work? Because you guys are the experts in their state. The people who do that work are the experts in these communities and the constituencies. And when there is downtime, like how do we help you bridge the gap to the federal? That's something that we've done a lot this year with Build Back Better, because so many of these state organizations were really engaged in the elections. And then once legislative sessions were over, it was like, okay, well, what do we do now? And like, there's been a big uptick in people participating in Build Back Better. That's not always the case in some of these places. Even with a part-time legislature, you have the Republican side that screw with us by elongating the session, right? And you know, there are challenges, but I would urge people who can to try and think about that and provoke those questions internally if you're taking roles that give you that opportunity.
Jess just popped in a question in the chat about folks looking to do this work and advice for people for what they put on their resumes, or dreaded resumes questions. What do you look for when you're looking at talent to hire? Things that people should focus on when they're doing interviews or writing up their experience.
Well, I would say now is probably not a great time to be trying to get into government relations because we're going into an election year. So let me answer this question as if you were asking it to me in October, November of next year. So if you're coming off of a campaign, you should definitely stay in touch with the people that ran your campaign, because a lot of the senior staff will jump over to the official side. And so you may be able to get a job in, assuming that your person gets elected, that you may be able to jump into an official role. But you should be making contacts as you go along, because people that do stick around in this business, even if they job hop and move around, people that you should know will still be doing this work in 5 or 10 years. So what you should emphasize or focus on in your resumes or interviews, I think, emphasize that your relationship building skills, that you can turn on a dime, that your jobs, that you had a whole bunch of different kinds of responsibilities with your job, that you weren't pigeonholed, that you are a multi-purpose person, that you are not really narrow in focus or abilities, and imply that you have a large Rolodex, because that's one of the things that's key for a lobbying job.
And to add on to that, I think the way that you help show that you have those relationships is to name check organizations, right? You don't name check people in a resume, but you do name check organizations. Be like, I did XYZ with 37 organizations, including, and then name check 5 of them that are like, oh, okay. And I would also say quantify as much as you can. If you did manage a budget, how much of a budget did you manage? Did you manage volunteers? How many volunteers did you manage? As much quantification as you can, I think makes I think really what that does is it makes the descriptions feel solid and real. So I have a challenge myself with quantifying things, particularly when I'm at jobs that, a bunch of time has passed and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't remember. It takes some time, but it's worth it. I think that that's as many numbers as you can give, just like you're writing a campaign plan or any kind of normal plan. Put as many numbers in there as you can.
And if you had to do any sort of annual reporting, I hate it while it's happening, but it saves your butt later because then you actually have all those numbers and quantifiable things that you can use.
I have a very different question for you. Something I've been thinking about a lot. We were very intentional actually in this conference of including sessions about wellness and self-care. And I can't say in any training or conference that I ever went to for the first good chunk of my career that was ever part of it. But I feel like organizations, and certainly we count ourselves among them, are trying to focus on not just taking care of ourselves personally, but changing work cultures and trying to make people realize that you don't actually have to work 80, 90 hours a week. But I also know that you are two people who have a tendency to do that. I know I am someone who has a tendency to do that. So just thoughts on that generally. Can people come into this work and actually have a life? And how do you maintain your lives? Sasha, not a good face. You're like, you have a life. I know you do.
So I think just as a person, I'm not intentional with self-care. I mean, I lived with, this is a little bit of personal, but I started living without my parents when I was 6 and without any family from when I was 9. And like, I'm just, you can drop me anywhere and I'll be a chameleon. I'll be just fine. And so I'm very like much the one foot in front of the other kind of person. And it's a new day and I'm going to make the best of it. So intentional, for me is about experiences. I'm not the person that's like every day I need to meditate, but it's probably just knowing who you are. And I can like save up all of my energy for that trip I'm going to take or, a long weekend I'm going to take. But I'll be honest, I do actually have a hard time when I'm working with people who have the expectation of it being a 9-to-5 job every day. I'm definitely in a space with 2 kids, and my mother, sandwich generation here. I'm sure there's other people on the call in the house where I want to spend more time with them, and I have more responsibilities than I had when I was, 10 or 20 years younger. But there are times, because we can't control these deadlines, where I do have to be on at night, or I do have to wake up really early and figure out childcare. And I'm really grateful that there's a lot of like fresh people in the business that are pushing self-care and more boundaries because it benefits everybody. And I am also challenged by the concept that these can ever be 9-to-5 jobs. So I think both are true. And I think, hopefully we all balance each other out and make this a sustainable place to live, because a sustainable place to work for the long haul. I'm 43 now. And I can't imagine I'm going to have my foot in anything else for the rest of my career. So that's my challenge right now. And it's one that's working for the most part, but I'm still figuring it out as to how do I do those things with my kids. And in America, school gets off at 3:00 in the afternoon, and we're all working parents. So that was a bit of a hodgepodge because I haven't figured it out.
Well, I haven't figured it out either. I grew up on 3 continents before I was 13, so I am used to change and throwing myself into a brand new place. And so I've done that. I've lived in a lot of states in the last 5 years, maybe more than 5 if I counted. So some of that is just the ability to pick yourself up and roll with it. But I think that there are some things you can do that perhaps Sasha and I should be better at. Figuring out your priorities and the ability to say no. I am bad at saying no. People keep asking me, I keep saying yes, and then I pile up a whole bunch of unpaid hobbies slash responsibilities slash boards slash so pick and choose and guard your time. And also my pro tip is I take almost all calls walking, even if I'm just pacing around in my apartment. That's how I get my 10,000 steps, is because I have hours of calls every day. I walk through it.
My heart's about to stop because I stop stepping. I sit in this chair all the time. So I'm going to take Laura's advice.
I just broke down, although I still haven't touched it yet. It literally got delivered yesterday and got a Peloton. So looking forward to using that. I wasn't getting any exercise myself. Any other, we've only got a few minutes left. There's a couple just comments that you're probably seeing them as I am. Other sort of advice for contacts, Angelica is asking. We all know that networking is critically important. I don't know if you have any more specific for her, or just generally resources. I don't know, Angelica, if you want to drop in where you are, maybe that's helpful too. But any other just networking advice?
Well, I see Angelica is looking more for state work more than federal work. I hate to put a whole unpaid and in fact costly burden on you, but you should start going to stuff. Sign up for all the email lists of all the progressive orgs in your state. And when they have meetings and when they have fancy parties, suck it up and go. Like after this, I'm heading to the governor's mansion for a holiday party end of year thing. I will do my schmoozing. And that's kind of, you need to know people in this work and how you meet those people, especially if you're not really a bar person, and also bars during a pandemic. But go to the fundraisers and the volunteer things and the happy hours and just be around and available and meet people and take their business cards. And then if it's applicable, follow up, but like not in a creepy way. Just, it was great to meet you, etc. But like if you're asking a perfect stranger for something that's high bar, you probably don't want to do that right away.
I have nothing to add. That was great advice.
Oh, and Angelica is in Colorado, currently Boulder. Boulder's a fun place, but Denver is probably the better networking place. So next year, presumably, there will start to be in-person events again. Denver Dems, Colorado Dems, LCV, NARAL, all of these groups have their big annual fundraisers and various other volunteering opportunities. And so start going.
Yeah, I was going to add any of the state voices, there's a bunch of table groups that have lots of events. Definitely in Colorado, but certainly other states for folks who are curious too. Obviously, online conferences like this and other training events Fundraisers, even if you can't donate, by the way, there's a lot of them that you could probably go to anyway. Maybe you can volunteer at them, or depending on who it is, that's always a great place to meet people. Usually people who are either hiring or organizing. Again, fundraisers is not something you think of, a lot of people think of as a social event, but they are. I've spent a lot of time going to a lot of different fundraisers. And people really appreciate it when you're someone who actually contributes, obviously, but also helps to organize them. And it doesn't matter if it's a candidate or an organization or an issue. Also volunteer on boards. Lots of organizations need active board members, and that's a great way to network too. And if you're someone who's an organizer and willing to contribute to some of your time doing that kind of work, it can be a great way to do networking. So many different issues. Finding your passion and figuring out what issues you care about is really important. Any other questions? I know we're running up on time here. I want to make sure we get them all out. I could sit and talk to you two ladies all day. I love seeing you, and I appreciate you both being here. Any parting advice for folks? Things you wish you knew perhaps before you did so many years of this work? Wisdom that you've gathered along the way?
Well, I tend to used to be a background person, so I worked on some very high profile things, and my focus was on the campaign winning, winning the issue. My focus was not on myself, and that is a good and reasonable thing to be, but always keep 1% of your mind thinking about you, because nobody else is going to think about you, and your job, especially if it's a campaign job, is going to end. So if you are at least even adjacent to the spotlight, be thinking about how you can make that work for you long term, because you're going to get opportunities that maybe you wish you could rewind and, oh, maybe I should have taken the business card of the Washington Post reporter and things like that, so nobody else probably is going to be thinking about you. So make sure you do a little bit. 99% winning, 1% your future.
Adding to that, and also Laura's earlier point about having a tendency to say yes to people and not being very good at saying no. I've tried to make a practice, and it's just an annual practice for me, or at the end of a job, is what have I enjoyed about this year, and what have I not enjoyed about this year? And oftentimes it's about responsibilities, right? By my performance reports, I'm good at managing people, but it's not actually something that I enjoy very much. So yes, to paying attention to where you're saying yes and no to people, but also it becomes easier to determine where you're saying yes and no as it relates to what you do. And because this work is so much about achieving the goal, right? And that we're often willing to do a lot of things, we have to remind ourselves, which is why I've been trying to make it a practice for me, what we actually are good at and what we enjoy, because they're two different things sometimes. And I think in this work, there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of gray tactically, values wise, and gray isn't bad, right? Like, I think you embrace the gray. That's how we connect to people. That's how we make it work. But also be really conscious of it. It was, as you get more and more responsibilities, when you have those connections and you showcase good work, it just always seemed like I should be saying yes to the next thing. And there were some gigs that I really didn't enjoy and maybe wasn't very good at, because I didn't take the time to be introspective about myself. So take that time, and part of what you're carving out with Laura's advice for yourself, just to connect in the moment with what you're doing and whether you're good at it or not, and whether you enjoy it or not, because that's a Venn diagram and you want to find the overlap.
I've become increasingly obsessed with this notion. It's I don't know if you guys have heard the Japanese word ikigai, but it is that notion of that Venn diagram of what you're good at, what you enjoy, what you get paid for, what the world needs. And if you can find sort of like what you do in the middle of all that, then that's your ikigai. And that's, I feel like, what everyone needs to find in life. And sometimes you move into one circle more than another, you know, but I think that we're all, if you're in this conference and you're on this series in any way, shape, or form, you know, we're all pretty lucky to get to do work and get paid to do work that we're passionate about, that certainly makes a difference in the world and the real people's lives. But some days that doesn't always feel that way. Maybe because we're not loving the specific thing we're having to do that day, or the world we're living in, what have you. I think that we can take a wrap here. I'll drop in. I think I know I have yours handy, Laura. I'll look for yours, Sasha, to drop in to the chat. I appreciate you both making time for this series, making time on a weekend, back to self-care, not saying no to me. And you probably could have and should have. But I also know that you're both people who, like me, is passionate about supporting others who do this work. And that's important. And I really appreciate you doing that. Thank you. Thank you. I think
find us on LinkedIn, find us on social media, keep in touch.
Sasha, I'm always finding, no matter how much I know, I'm finding youth works for you. It's annoying when I go to look you up. It like pulls up the other. But I will drop that in. And
it's LinkedIn at Sasha Bruce. Sasha L. Bruce is the end.
Got it. All right. I'll put it in here.
For those of you that live in DC, there's an organization here called the Sasha Bruce Youth Works, so it gets very confusing.
I will put it in the chat before we close. Very good. Well, we're right on time. I don't want to keep you over. I, again, appreciate you both being here. Appreciate everyone being here, for that matter. It's been a long day. We've got one more session, believe it or not. We were very intentional about not being totally East Coast centric, but that also means that we're going later for other time zones. And we do have folks all over the country chiming in here. But it's been a great session and appreciate you both. Love you both. Thank you very much.